are ready to begin working on laying out our pattern pieces for our construction sample notebook. So the first thing we're going to need to do before we actually lay our pattern pieces out on the fabric to cut them out of fabric is we're going to need to cut around our pattern pieces so that we get rid of any of the extra paper that we have. So you're just going to take your paper scissors and follow the outside cutting line. You're going to cut around the pattern pieces. When you come to the notch, make sure that you actually cut those notches out so that you have a triangular wedge sticking out from your pattern edge, so that when you are ready to actually sew that, you're going to have your notches for lining your pattern pieces together to make sure that they're aligned properly as you begin to sew them. So we're just going to cut around the contour shape of our pattern piece on the cutting line. It's very important that as you're cutting out your pattern pieces that you do cut them the exact shape and size of that pattern piece, so make sure that you cut on that cutting line. If you do not cut according to the exact cutting line, when you go to sew those pattern pieces together, they're not going to fit right because they're not going to be cut exact, and you're going to end up with pattern pieces that don't line up. You're also going to end up with a garment that doesn't fit properly as well. Alright, so you're going to cut that out. The darts, you're actually going to leave those in, cut around the edge. Make sure that you leave this here. This is not a cutting line, that's going to be your stitching line. So you're going to go through all of your pattern pieces, your yellow ones, your green ones, your pink ones, your blue ones, and all of your white ones, and cut these out.
With your pattern pieces cut out, we're now ready to lay our pattern pieces onto our fabric to cut our fabric out so that we can do that. So you're going to need to get your fabric out of your Ziploc bag, and you're going to need your big piece, your little piece, and your interfacing. You're also going to need to get your tape measure to ensure the line that it's lined up. You're also going to need to get your pins, and these pins will get you started. You probably are not going to have enough, and you need to get your shears.
To lay our pattern pieces out on our fabric, we're going to use our pattern piece guide, which was in your packet. So we are going to fold our fabric and lay our pattern pieces out according to the diagram that we have here. So this is going to be fabric 1, fabric 2, and fabric 3 are all going to be your large piece of fabric. So we are going to start by getting our large piece of fabric, and we're going to lay it out so that the selvages, so the two selvages, meet in the middle, and we have a fold on both sides of our fabric when it is laid out. To lay out our large piece of fabric, we have the selvages, so we have two selvages here folded on top of each other, and we have a fold on this side. We're going to open our fabric up so that we see the wrong side of the fabric, and we are going to fold our fabric so that our selvage comes back to the middle, or where our original fold was, and then we're going to do that on both sides, so that when we have our fabric folded, we have our selvages meeting each other in the middle, and we have a fold on this side, and we have a fold on this side of our fabric. As you are lining those up, it's very important that your fabric lay flat with the selvages meeting, meaning that if our ends don't match up, that's okay, because our fabric may not have been cut straight, but we need to have our selvages meeting each other, parallel to each other, and our fabric laying flat and smooth so that we keep the grain lines correct in our fabric. And so you want to fold your fabric like that, the length of the fabric. All right, to lay out our pattern pieces, we're going to follow the guide sheet. And so we're going to lay them out just like they are on here. So we're going to place 20, piece number 20, piece number 22, 29, 21, 29, 29, 29, look down, another 22, and then we have a 1, we have 2, we have a 29, another 2, another 1. And so go ahead and lay all of your pattern pieces out. Once you get your pattern pieces laid out the length of your fabric according to your guide sheet, then you're going to be ready to pin those onto the fabric. So with a pattern piece that has a guide for the seam, or the guide, the grain line to go against the fold, remember it has the arrows that are turned, and so with that we're going to place this edge of the pattern piece on the fold of the fabric, and you're going to pin that down. And it's very important that you're exact on your pinning on the fold so that your pattern piece turns out the size that it should. Okay, so this one is also on the fold, so you can go ahead and pin that one down. Alright, for a pattern piece that's not on the fold, we have our grain line. To ensure that our grain line of our pattern piece matches the lengthwise grain of our fabric, we're going to put a pin in the top end of the grain line, and then we're going to take our tape measure and we're going to measure from the grain line over to the fold, or if you had selvages you could measure to the selvages. My measurement is 7 3/4 inches. So then I'm going to move down to the other end of the grain line. I'm going to put the tape measure so that 7 3/4 lines up at the edge of the fabric, and I'm going to move the grain line till it matches the end of my tape. Then I'm going to put a pin in that end of the pattern piece, and then go ahead and pin down the remaining portion of the pattern piece. That way we're ensured that our grain line is lined up. So again, how do we do that? We have our grain line that we're going to start with here, and we're going to put a pin in the top of the grain line. And we're going to take our tape measure, line it up on the grain line, measure over to our fold. I have 13 3/8. So then I'm going to move down to the other end of the pattern piece, the other end of the grain line. I'm going to line my tape up so that the fold is 13 3/8 inches, and then I'm going to move my pattern piece so that my grain line lines up with the end of my tape measure, so that this end is also 13 3/8 inches from the fold, so that this grain line is now parallel to the lengthwise grain of my fabric. And I will go ahead then and pin down the rest of my pattern pieces. When you continue this until you get all of your pattern pieces actually pinned down, and then you'll be ready to cut. Lay out our small piece of fabric, which is going to be fabric sheet 4. We are going to have the same diagram, but this time I'm actually having to change the diagram that's on here to lay our pattern pieces out in a new way. So the corrected layout is posted to Moodle. And then what we're doing this time is, rather than having the selvages in the middle like we did for the big piece, we're going to have one fold, and we're going to have our selvages meeting each other on the other edge. To fold our fabric for our small piece of fabric, we're going to fold it like it came off of the bolt when we bought it in the store. So we have one fold on this side of our fabric, and on our other side we have our two selvages that are laying one on top of the other. We're going to make sure that our fabric is smooth so that we have our grain lines correct, and it's okay if our ends don't match at the top and the bottom, and we're going to lay our fabric piece out like that, smooth all the way down the piece of fabric. The last piece of fabric that we're going to lay out is our inner facing. And with our inner facing, we are going to have one fold, and we're going to have our selvages folded on top of each other so that we have selvages on both sides, and then we have raw edges at the other end across from our fold. Then we're going to lay our pattern pieces out as diagrammed. To prepare our interfacing fabric, we're going to open our interfacing fabric, and you have a thin piece of fabric. You had two selvages on each end and a fold. We're going to open that up so that we have two selvages. So we have a selvage here and a selvage on the other side, and we're going to fold that so that our selvages are here and they are folding on top of each other. So we have two layers of fabric. We have a selvage here, we have a selvage here, we have the raw cut edge here, and we have the fold here. So when we have our pattern pieces laid out for our interfacing, they should be according to the diagram. We have our fold here, we have our pieces that have the grain line to be placed on the fold, and then we have our other pieces that are not on the fold. With interfacing, it is a non-woven fabric, so the grain line is not the same as in a woven or a knit with having a lengthwise and a crosswise grain. We do line our grain lines up even with the selvages or the fold to make sure that it's straight on the fabric, but we can put them the opposite direction if we need to utilize the fabric versus having our grain lines follow the lengthwise grain running parallel to the fabric. Once you have all your pattern pieces laid out on your big piece of fabric and your small piece of fabric, then you're going to be ready to cut out your pattern pieces. So you're going to want to get your fabric shears, and you're going to cut out all of your pattern pieces. When you cut out a piece that is on the fold, you do not cut along the edges on the fold. So we're going to cut around the other edges of the pattern piece. So you want to cut right on that black cutting line or the edge of your fabric. You want to make sure that you cut your fabric pieces the exact size of your pattern so that you have them so they'll match up with that. So you're going to cut around those. Okay. When you cut a pattern piece that's not on the fold, you go ahead and cut around the entire pattern piece. When you're cutting, try to keep your fabric as close to the table without lifting it up as possible so that you get a good straight cut in the size of your pattern pieces. When you're cutting a piece out that has notches, so again, this is not on the fold, so we're going to cut all the way around it. When we come to a notch, we're actually going to come up and cut that notch out so that we have a triangular wedge of fabric that extends out past our pattern piece. When you cut double notches, you don't actually cut down in between the two triangles. You just cut up and then cut across both of them and back down. Across. When you come to a dart, follow the shape of the dart. Don't cut straight across. Alright, so now when you've cut out your pattern pieces, those that are not on the fold, we're going to leave our pattern pieces on until we're ready to sew so that we know what they are. But when you have a piece that's with a straight grain line, when you take the pattern piece off and you have your fabric, you should have two pieces of fabric that when the right sides are up, they're mirror images of the other. So you have a left side and a right side. Okay. When you have a piece that is on the fold, when you take the pattern piece off of that and you open it up, you should have one piece that is twice the size of your pattern piece. You have a left side and a right side, but you have one piece of fabric. So go ahead and cut out all of your pattern pieces out of your big piece of fabric, your small piece of fabric, and your interfacing. When you're done cutting them out, I recommend that you put them all back in your Ziploc bag so that you don't lose them. And if you want to divide them in smaller bags, that's fine if you want to do them by color, so that as you're pulling them out ready to use them for our samples, they're easily able to be found.